Today, 7th of March 2025, we have a discussion that will focus on the current geopolitical events. And as a guest, we have Eugene Chausovsky, who is Senior Director at New Lines Institute in the United States. Hello, Eugene.
Hi,
Hope you hear
Denys.
me well. Hope you hear me well.
Yes, I do.
So today is more or less 3 months since the Bashar al-Assad was toppled in Syria, and he fled to Russia, and the new HTS government forces took the power in the country. And this morning, I was reading that there were some clashes that have erupted actually in Latakia region between the pro-Assad forces, Alawite forces, and the HTS Islamist forces. And I actually also know that there is an ongoing negotiation between the Russians and the new Syrian government of Bashar regarding because the Russians actually they want to keep their bases in Latakia, namely Khmimim and Latakia naval facility. And I wonder, and maybe you will answer to this question, whether those fightings are somehow related to those negotiations that are taking place right now.
Right. Well, I don't know. It's difficult to say whether the fighting is directly related to the negotiations with the Russians, but clearly there's still a lot of reverberations and ripple effects from that, from the HTS, overthrow of the Assad government, as you mentioned a few months ago. So things had been up until now relatively calm, but as we can see, there are still some strongholds, some resistance points from, Assad-backed forces. This is part of a broader redrawing of the map, if you will, of not only of Syria, but we've seen a lot of developments related, for example, with the PKK and as it relates to Turkey. Obviously, the ongoing conflicts in Gaza and Lebanon. Despite the fact that there's ceasefires there, clearly a lot of movement happening. So I think that we're seeing this jockeying of position setting into what is going to be a new normal in the Middle East, but we're not quite there yet. So whether it's related to the Russians, whether it's related to Iran, obviously Turkey, the US, a lot of different players are still quite active here, even as we're seeing some players rise, other players fall, but it's not just a clean break from one to another. And that's, I think, what's going on right now.
Yeah, that's completely true. There are different actors that are still trying to maintain or extend their influence in Syria. But going back actually to the Russians, in your opinion, what kind of bargaining chip they have while negotiating with the Syrians to preserve their military bases? And this is the first part of question. And the second part of question, actually, I wonder if they do not manage to preserve their presence, how it will may affect their operations in Africa and in the region. Because I guess those bases are quite important for the logistics. I'm not only speaking about security, but even the logistics.
Right. Yeah, I mean, in terms of bargaining chips, I mean, we saw Russia in the, under Assad obviously have a lot of influence and provide a lot of support, whether that be security support. You mentioned the two bases, against anti-Assad forces. That equation has obviously changed quite a bit, but yet we see the Russians trying to maintain that foothold or at least negotiating with with the HTS-led government in order to maintain at least partially its presence there. Russia can always play, even if it's on the back foot, it has the ability to play the spoiler role. So I think that kind of goes back to your first question, whether or not Russia is directly tied to this, but the fact that, these pro-Assad forces are still active and are resisting, despite the fact that al-Shara has been trying to consolidate his power base, get all of these different armed groups, militias, what have you, into the fold of this new Syrian government. So Russia has that leverage, right, that it could play a spoiler role, along with, Iran to a certain extent. In terms of the overall impact on its forces in, whether it's in Africa, North Africa, other parts. I mean, this is something that I think really you have to take it on a case by case basis, right? Because while we've seen Russia obviously on the back foot in Syria, of course their first focus is on the war in Ukraine, where given the recent diplomatic developments, they've been at an advantage of sorts, or at least trying to cash in on that advantage. In Africa, we've seen some moves to Russia's advantage as well as countries like France have and the US have been slowly withdrawing. But it's not an all or nothing kind of thing. I think every single theater, as interconnected as they are, needs to be sort of assessed in its own right. I haven't seen anything that suggests that Russia is going to be on the decline in Africa. And if anything, they've looked at places like Libya, right, in the event that losing their access in Syria. But as you've discussed, they're negotiating in order to maintain that. So clearly, these theaters are interconnected. One can have an impact on another, but I wouldn't necessarily say that Russia is losing here and they're losing everywhere. In fact, we've seen quite a mixed result of that.
I understand. And actually, since you've mentioned the United States, and I guess it leads us to another question, and with recent potential shifts in the U.S. foreign policy, because before what happened last Friday in the Oval Office between Ukraine's President Zelensky and the United States President Donald Trump. So could you please maybe describe, not speaking particularly about the event of last Friday, but generally speaking, how do you see because we have a lot of discussions, in the European Union, and a lot of experts and statesmen are on alert, what we'll be going to do, etc. And the NATO discussion, how the United States will remain relevant to the Article 5, and a lot of discussions. But how do you assess what is happening in Washington, D.C., with regard to the foreign policy? Do all those declarations indicate a real shift in the U.S. foreign policy, or it's rather some kind of a, let's say, negotiation strategy for the United States and testing other counterparts and players and trying to get the best result from Washington wants?
Yeah, I do think this is part of a negotiation strategy for sure, but also I would say there is clearly a shift taking place. And I think the broader contours of this foreign policy, as I would describe it for the Trump administration, is one that's very transactional in nature, meaning that they're looking to make a deal, they're looking to essentially improve their position vis-a-vis all kinds of different countries, whether that be allies like the Europeans and Ukraine, adversaries like China and Russia, Iran, and anyone in between, right? So if you just look at the events that happened, in the Oval Office last week, and just generally the U.S. posture towards Ukraine, and by extension the Europeans, this is saying that, look, we're not going to be just supporting Ukraine, we meaning the Trump administration, supporting Ukraine at any cost. We first of all want to end this war, and if that means striking a deal with the Russians, then so be it, right? That's not to say that it's a complete abandonment of Ukraine, and certainly not of the Europeans. I would draw a distinction there. I think it is worth noting, even though I'm sure your viewers are, aware of this, but Ukraine is not technically a part of NATO or technically a part of the EU, so there's no formal abandonment there. Obviously, this has been an allied country, one that the U.S. has supported financially, militarily for several years. But technically, there's not an abrogation of a treaty there. When it comes to the Europeans, that is a big question mark, in terms of Article 5 and what that would mean for the Europeans. But I personally think that the U.S. and the Trump administration would draw a line there. There's nothing that they would indicate that they're going to be, leaving NATO or abandoning Article 5. But again, it's transactional in nature, so that then you look at what is the level of defense spending. Clearly, the U.S. is putting pressure on the Europeans to step up and support Ukraine more directly, whether that be through weaponry, whether that be through peacekeeping forces. And I think that the U.S. will maintain some level of backing. It's not a complete abandonment, but if there's going to be resistance to that, then that could lead to negative consequences, as we saw with the meeting last Friday. So we are seeing a shift, I think, but it's not a complete reorientation from the U.S. away from Ukraine and away from the Europeans towards Russia necessarily. It's just everything is transactional, and all countries are viewed in that lens, from my point of view.
Okay, Angela, because the Donald Trump's declarations about Greenland, for example, they have sparked a lot of different comments in the European Union and in Denmark for obvious reasons. So I just wonder what was the idea of those comments. Was he playing for local audiences? I mean, the local supporters in the United States and local groups, or it was some kind of a message that the United States becomes somehow unpredictable actor, and we can no longer rely on the United States as it was before, for example. I know that you have already touched upon those issues in your answer, but could you please elaborate a bit more?
Yeah, so I think this goes to the negotiating strategy, and I think we've seen this, from Trump on a number of different theaters, whether it's Greenland, whether it's, on Mexico and Canada on trade, on Gaza, start with an extreme position, essentially ask for everything, right? So in this case, we want to acquire Greenland. That then, I mean, sets the tone for the negotiations moving forward. So even if you're not likely going to get that extreme position, but it does sort of frame the talks moving forward, right? We've seen that, for example, with in the Gaza situation where it starts with U.S. ownership of Gaza. That then sent the Arab states kind of scrambling to a certain extent to have their own counter proposal, which we're now kind of in the middle of that negotiation. With Greenland, there are significant interests there for sure. I'm not saying that it's just it's not just rhetoric. If Trump can get that extreme position, great. If not, then what can be negotiated, right? So clearly, the U.S. is interested in Greenland from a resource perspective, from a security perspective, given its location in terms of Arctic shipping routes and things of that nature. And that has then sent the response from the Europeans, from Denmark, from France, et cetera, to basically have their own counter proposal of sorts. Now, that could just be no, we're not interested in this. This could actually lead to tensions as we've seen, but at least it sets the tone for some kind of negotiation that didn't happen, that didn't exist before, right? So I'm
Mm.
not saying that this strategy is necessarily successful or not, but I do think we've seen some patterns about how the administration has handled this, how, it starts with a kind of, a carrot and stick strategy. And if you're talking about trade, it is, as it's proven, willing to actually implement that. So it's not just, naked threats, so to speak. We have seen the US, for example, pass tariffs on China
Yeah.
twice, and then on Canada and Mexico pass them and then revoke them essentially, right? So in order to elicit some kind of concessions, financial, security, or otherwise.
Yeah, I understand. And maybe the last question on this US bloc is actually the Russo-Ukrainian war. And so we are seeing that as you have already mentioned, that there is some shifts in the US policy and US approach, let's say, regarding this conflict. But it has actually already produced some results when we talk about the European context. But do you think that the, let's say, unconditional surrender of Ukraine may be of interest to the United States foreign policy? I mean, the question is a bit maybe framed differently, not in the best position, but still, how could you explain the implications for the US interests if, for instance, Ukraine concedes defeat or gets some of, let's say, up to 20% of its territory occupied by the Russians? And for instance, Ukraine gets no guarantees, because that's the question we are asking a lot right now in Europe. And as you know, for example, the President Emmanuel Macron also have made declarations that it would endanger the European security. So please, the floor is yours for this answer.
Sure. So I would say I don't think it's in the US interest for Ukraine just to concede defeat, under any conditions. I think more so it's about getting the Europeans to step up and to play a stronger role, which I think we're seeing that, process unfold now. And it is basically, about allowing the US to basically pivot its focus to other areas as a result. I think a lot has been made about these, perceived concessions that the U.S. has made to Russia when it comes to, for example, no NATO membership for Ukraine, the freezing basically of the territory where it is now, the U.S. not providing a direct security guarantee in terms of peacekeeping forces. And all of that, I think, is legitimate and is cause for legitimate concern, especially, of course, for Ukraine, but also for the Europeans. But I think what's being discussed less is what are the concessions out of Russia in such a negotiation, because, you know, officially we haven't seen many concessions, if any. But I think more behind closed doors, what the US is trying to do is get Russia's support on things like China. Support meaning not necessarily flipping from China to the US, because I don't think that's realistic, but even in certain areas, tactical areas, to lessen Russia's engagement and support of China. We've seen this past week about, reports about the US trying to get Russia to as an intermediary with Iran, for example, for nuclear program talks. So this to me shows that essentially the message that the Trump administration is sending is that, Ukraine, it's an important issue, but that's one that needs to be handled first and foremost by the Europeans
Yeah.
with some level of support from the US, whether it be the critical minerals deal, some level of backing, right? But the US is trying to focus primarily on China first and foremost, and then on kind of lessening the chances for major destabilization or potential conflicts in the Middle East, So there's certainly a reprioritization happening, but again, I wouldn't equate that to the US is just not interested in Ukraine at all costs. It's abandoning Ukraine without any concessions from Russia. I just think that those concessions that they're looking for are not necessarily directly tied to the Ukraine conflict, and they're not going to be necessarily said explicitly, right? That's at least from my vantage point. I could be wrong about that, but that's just kind of from my analysis, what I've been seeing as these negotiations unfold.
Yes, exactly. That's what's interesting is to have your analysis of the situation. And as you obviously have followed, so the European reaction on you remember the Munich Security Conference, for example, sparked a lot of debates in Europe, and then candidate for the elections in Germany, um, he said that he suggested that maybe the Europeans should think about the nuclear deterrent for themselves. And right now in the European Union, only France has its nuclear force, because the United Kingdom are no longer part of the European Union. And as this discussion, this idea actually, and his party won the election, by the way, in Germany. And but this idea also reverberates with the French position, actually, because Emmanuel Macron, our president, he has stated for numerous occasions that France may extend its say nuclear deterrent to other European areas. And just a few days ago, it was yet again debated, in France. So I wonder, from your perspective, I understand that you're in the United States, but from your perspective, is it even possible, actually, for Europe to have its own nuclear deterrent, especially given that for example, Germans, it's the economic power number one in Europe, and France is, let's say, political and military power, but it's not still in Germans' interests to support France to this way, so that France gets the overall leadership in Europe. So I just wonder whether it's possible at all to have the nuclear deterrent in Europe.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think it is possible, but right now what we're clearly seeing is, this is one of the ripple effects of the US position on Ukraine, is clearly that the Europeans are now having to reassess not only their, support for Ukraine, but the entire security architecture of the European continent. And that could have the effect of Europe becoming more autonomous from the US, right? So there could be, from a strategic perspective, that would be a significant development. In terms of extending the nuclear deterrent, we've seen some back and forth, for example, also on a European army of sorts, where that's been floated around, but then some countries are not. Some countries support it, some countries are not so comfortable with it, and this is really the challenge for an actor like the EU, because it's a collection of 27 member states, not including, of course, the UK, which is relevant in this context. So it's going to be difficult to have kind of a unanimous look on some of these issues. But I think that the bigger point is that the security architecture of Europe is being reassessed, clearly because of the US shift in its policy. Now, whether it's France that emerges as a leader, Germany obviously has been reluctant for various reasons. The UK is still a very important security actor on the continent, even if it's outside of the EU. So that I think needs to be basically, hashed out, and that's what we're in the process of seeing over these coming months. So difficult to say whether one or another of these initiatives will be successful or not. I'm sure it will change over time. But clearly, the Europeans do need to reevaluate, how they interact with not only, Russia, but also the US and what is its place essentially in this new reality.
Yeah, and so because we have right now the discussions whether because Emmanuel Macron has been heavily criticized when he said a few years ago that NATO was brain dead, and right now we hear uh, other opinions saying maybe he wasn't so wrong at all. you know. Anyways, I'd like to shift us back to the Russo-Ukrainian war because this conflict resurged again on the media landscape and became yet again one of the case subjects and given the security implications for the Europeans at least. How could you describe the current Russian strategy and approach to this war? Because when they have launched the full-scale invasion, they have made different declarations, and from what I understand, they had quite optimistic ideas about what they could have obtained from their military actions. It seems they didn't succeed as of today. So, what is current? Let's say, what was the initial, in your opinion, Russian strategy regarding its invasion of Ukraine, and how did it evolve with the time? And speaking about right now.
Right. So yeah, I think, Russian strategy, and I think it's worth pointing out here that the war didn't just start 3 years ago. It's been going on for more than a decade, but especially since the full-scale invasion, I think the strategy was, to try to see how far they could push, including to see if they could, capture Kiev and essentially overthrow the pro-Western government in Ukraine. And clearly that was not successful, right? With the Ukrainians, standing firm, pushing back. Um, and I think since then the strategy has evolved to, hold the primary areas of, essentially the land bridge between its holdings in eastern Ukraine and Crimea, which existed prior to, 2022, and to expand their territory, particularly in the Donbass and in southern Ukraine in order to have that land bridge, which that so far has been successful, even as they haven't completely controlled all of those territories, but they're kind of slowly aiming to achieve that objective. But even broader than that, beyond Ukraine, the objective has been to, prevent Ukraine's NATO membership and to challenge essentially the Western-led architecture of Europe and to send that message, which you can go back to Georgia in 2008, right? But that this expansion of NATO further into the former Soviet periphery is something that Russia is trying to obviously avoid, whether that's through direct military action, through hybrid action, and what have you. So, yeah, go ahead.
You've just mentioned one of the reasons, and we hear it. It's true. We hear it a lot from the Russians that one of their objectives is to keep Ukraine out of NATO. So could you please tell why is it so important for the Russians? Because we know that, for example, following this conflict, the Finland and Sweden have joined the NATO alliance and didn't really bother the Russians. So why Ukraine's membership in NATO is so important from Moscow's standpoint?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think, Sweden and Finland, Russia is certainly against any expansion of NATO, but particularly in the former Soviet territories that Russia used to control, right? Back in the Soviet period. And Ukraine is really the heart of this, right? I mean, Georgia, Moldova, these are important countries, and obviously Russia went to war in Georgia in order to prevent, NATO membership there. But Ukraine is really the linchpin, if you will. This is it's the largest former Soviet republic in terms of population. It's rich in resources, agricultural and otherwise, and just its geographic location is kind of right, kind of abutting the core of Russia in that, Moscow and St. Petersburg corridor. So for Russia, Ukraine has a strategic significance and a history that obviously, Sweden and Finland do not have to that extent. Um, and so this is something that, Russia has clearly been, willing to do whatever is necessary, militarily and otherwise in order to prevent that from happening. And that does appear, at least as of right now, to be successful in that sense. So a lot has been made about, how much Russia has lost from the war in terms of, manpower, economically, and all of that is true. But that just goes to show how high of a priority that Ukraine is, and that Russia was willing to basically reorient its entire economy, its entire foreign policy, essentially, now pivoting to China, pivoting to the global south, so to speak, that break with the West, which now is in the processes of being reevaluated, at least from the standpoint of the US. Right. So from a strategic standpoint, clearly Russia's strategy is to, keep Ukraine out of NATO, keep Ukraine neutral at the very least, if not pro-Russian, which I think is not realistic given everything that we've seen, right? But keep Ukraine effectively neutral, make sure that NATO and especially the US are not expanding and if it can to weaken, NATO from within. And you can see that Russia has had some success, at least some mixed success in all of that. It did not overtake all of Ukraine, and I don't think, clearly that galvanized more support, more solidarity between Ukraine and the Europeans, even between Ukraine and the US up until, the recent administration. So there's been some gains from Russia, there's been some losses, but Russia has the benefit of time on its side. And here's where, its political system is able to wait out, democracies and election cycles in places like Europe and especially in the United States.
Yeah, I understand. Indeed, that's what it seems to be. Speaking about Ukraine and its importance for Russia, because Finland was part of the Russian Empire, for example, as well, but we didn't observe such reaction from Moscow regarding Finland's NATO membership. Yeah, that's true. And you've actually mentioned the Russian foreign policy and it changes after or following the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And pivoting to China. From what I remember, years ago, Russians were trying to, let's say, develop the relations with China as somehow equal partners, but given the Russian weakened position, or as I see it, Russia is turning into somehow a weaker partner in this cooperation with Beijing. So how could you explain and how do you evaluate this Russian foreign policy shift and pivoting to China and in my opinion, decreasing role of Russia in this bilateral partnership? Am I right? Am I wrong? So please go ahead.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think, the pivot to China has been one out of essentially necessity given the events of Ukraine and the rupture in, essentially the complete rupture in Russia's relationship with the West. Um, the nature of that relationship as a junior partner, clearly China is the more powerful, economy. And it's arguably the biggest rival to the US as a global power. Having said that, I think that Russia has historically always been weak economically relative to its power projection militarily, for example. And I think even now, Russia is much more willing to use its military, its security, power projection abroad, whether that be in Ukraine, whether that be even, what we talked about in the Middle East and Africa, to a larger extent than China has. So I think that, yeah, if you're just kind of measuring by economic strength, clearly China is the large power. Russia's pivot to China has entailed, essentially sending its energy supplies to China, other kind of natural resources being part of the Belt and Road Initiative. So that does make Russia a kind of, a junior partner, if you will. But having said that, I do think that they have a sort of balance of a sort of what's the term for it? A division of labor, if you will, of their strengths and of their weaknesses. So, and here we've seen that in places like Central Asia and other areas, even in the Middle East, where Russia is, despite its setbacks in Syria, is still a more active player, right, than China is comfortable with being or has the ability to be. That could certainly change in the future. I think there's certainly, tension points between Russia and China. I mean, if you just look geopolitically speaking, and this is something that the US is trying to play into by peeling Russia away from China, which I have my own thoughts about how successful that will be, but it does kind of make sense. So as with all of these things that we're discussing, it's a little bit more nuanced than Russia is simply a junior partner of China, even though that may be true in a lot of contexts. But I think this is also something that is not necessarily the fact that they're aligned so much is a product of the circumstances, much more so than they're just naturally, have affinity towards one another. So this is something that could change in the future, but clearly right now, the geopolitical winds have blown them together, so to speak.
Yeah, I understand. And just to actually finalize our the Russian block, if you want, of questions, the last question I have is about the ceasefire, because we are having a lot of talks right now and a lot of even noise, I would say, different messaging coming from Russia, coming from the Europeans, coming from the White House. In your opinion, is Russia really interested in a ceasefire? Because I'm not talking about a lasting peace. Then I have my opinions and my thoughts about it. But at least is Russia interested in a ceasefire? And if it is interested in this ceasefire, what kind of result it may produce in future? Because personally, I think that given that the Russian and the war is basically the way to achieve the political goals, as we're talking about, this general idea, the use of military forces is only the prolongation of of, of policy, of political intentions. I just wonder actually whether it's not in their interest to have a ceasefire and because we observe that the Russians are rearming. They have stricken some deals with, say, global South countries, and maybe in future renew their aggression against Ukraine, given that Ukraine will not be protected most likely and will not receive guarantees Kiev is seeking. So maybe they would be interested to use this ceasefire to rearm themselves, better prepare, and try to launch another invasion of Ukraine. Or what is this point of this discussion? Or they're bluffing, they don't want this ceasefire. So what is your analysis of this whole ceasefire narrative, let's say?
Yeah, I do think that the Russians are interested in a ceasefire along their terms, so to speak, right? So, as you say, a ceasefire is very different from a broader peace agreement. And so, whether that's to buy themselves time to rearm and to, launch future actions, that's certainly at least the capability that the Russians want to have. But if they can get a ceasefire on the terms that they laid out, from the beginning of the war, so essentially, to sort of, quote unquote, demilitarize Ukraine, or at least keep it out of NATO, to consolidate the territory that they've gained, and to make that formally or informally a part of Russia, and to have, primarily the US sign off on that. I think that's clearly a ceasefire, that Russia would be interested in, because it kind of validates their entire kind of purpose. I don't think that they necessarily just want to keep this war going forever. And certainly we've seen the military limitations for how far they can push, right? But that will depend on, what the US is willing to concede, what the Europeans, and of course Ukraine itself. I think if they're going to push for, security guarantees. Like Russia has already spoken out against any NATO-based peacekeeping forces, right? Which is obviously something that that Ukraine and the Europeans are really stressing. So that perhaps would not be a ceasefire that Russia would be interested in, but we're in the middle of a negotiation process. One that, as I've mentioned before, relates not only to Ukraine, but also to other areas between the US and Russia, right? Whether it's
Yeah.
China, whether it's Iran, et cetera. So yeah, I definitely think that there are, if you look at it just from a strategic interest standpoint, there are definitely things pointing to Russia being open to a ceasefire. I don't think they would be negotiating if they weren't, but that is to kind of achieve their broader objectives, which is to to neutralize Ukraine at the very least, to undermine any sort of European solidarity, European unity on the security front, and to sort of peel away U.S. support for such on the continent.
Yeah, and this actually brings us to our last question or last few questions, and it's about the new world order actually in the making. Maybe I frame it this way. Maybe you would frame it another way. But from my standpoint, how I see things going on, it's obviously a rearrangement of the world that has existed, previously. And when we see the Russians, they are for years actually they have been communicating and they have been seeking a better place for themselves and let's say this multipolar world. And just recently, Russia's foreign minister Lavrov, he said that, I quote, maybe this is not direct quote, but the idea was that 500 years of the Western dominance of world has ended, and so the new reality is the bipolar world. So, in your opinion, first of all, whether it's true, whether it's correct, are we really seeing the world changing and evolving into something different, maybe with the UN in future disappearing or being replaced by something, or some kind of a new Yalta agreement or a deal, if you want, or maybe it's not true at all. We are still in this the Western-dominated world, and what Russians are saying and doing is just not enough for them to establish the what they want to achieve.
Yeah, so I do think that we're, in a definitely a new world order, and I would agree with you in terms of, being multipolar. And this, by the way, is not something that just happened, this year. This has been a process of shifting, I would argue, for the last decade or so, where you have, the main global powers of the U.S. and now China competing with one another. You have global players, as I would describe them, the EU now kind of being its own essentially autonomous power bloc, Russia to a lesser extent. And then you have a whole host of these regional players, countries that we've seen be active both in their own kind of neighborhoods, but even to some extent beyond it. I'm thinking countries like Turkey, India, the Gulf states, and then a whole host of non-aligned or even non-state actors, as we've seen, the emergence of players like Elon Musk, for example. So definitely multipolar, I would argue. And that creates a lot of dynamism that we're seeing. And with countries sort of, pivoting and serving as swing players, this is why when we look at something like the Russia-Ukraine conflict, it's no longer just about the US, the Europeans, and Russia, right? Now we have Turkey playing a mediating role, the Gulf states playing a mediating role. China obviously has, Iran, et cetera, right? You can go down the line about how involved these countries are. And that same thing applies to the Middle East. That same thing applies to the Indo-Pacific. So this, like I mentioned, this is a shift that has been in place for some time, and I think it's now being really accelerated and accentuated because of the shift in the US foreign policy, which kind of brings us back to the beginning of our conversation. So the fact that the foreign policy is now more transactional and less based off of traditional alliances per se, I think only accentuates this multipolar world that we're in even more so.
Yeah, I understand. And maybe if a question or a few remarks about the Middle Eastern region, because we've seen in October 2023 this Hamas attack against Israel, and then Israel retaliating, and then Iran coming to even going up to attacking Israel directly, and then Israel made some strikes in Iran. And right now it seems that Israel is the winner in this conflict, but at the same time the questions were not dealt with. Okay, partially those elements also participated in the deposition of Bashar al-Assad in Syria, for instance. But how do you see all those events and dynamics in the Middle East evolving and shaping new realities for the region? Maybe the question is a bit too global, but if you could maybe name a few trends that are really crucial for the region in particular, and also globally with regard to this new world order happening and offering new dynamics in international relations.
Yeah. So I think, clearly Israel has emerged, in a stronger position as a result of, in the post-October 7th environment, degrading, not only Hamas, but also Hezbollah, in Lebanon. As you mentioned, there was the direct kind of tit for tat strikes between Israel and Iran directly, which was the first time that we've seen that level of activity. Um, and then the ceasefires as a result of that, which then had the ripple effects in Syria and other places that we've already talked about. So moving forward, I do see that because this is a very interconnected kind of region, and actions in one theater can quickly spill over into another. I would pay particular close attention to the Iran component of it. Right now, we're seeing, the question is, will Israel use this, their gains as a window of opportunity to strike at essentially the source of those proxy groups, if you will, which is obviously Iran, the main backer of those groups. And there's been some reporting, there's been some indications that Israel is considering such an action kind of more, in a more intense way. At the same time, though, we're seeing, the U.S. both apply the carrot and stick strategy to Iran as well, kind of reaching out to talk about the nuclear program. Trump just sent a letter, I think, just over the last couple of days to kind of reopen those negotiations, while also threatening things like, seizing oil tankers in the Strait of
Yeah.
Hormuz and things of that nature. So that then goes to your question about the global elements. We saw, for example, the implications from the Gaza conflict, shipping through the Red Sea dramatically reduced. So we saw kind of the spillover effects of that due to those Houthi missile attacks. So if we were to see some kind of major activity in the Strait of Hormuz, which is a crucial choke point, that's where a lot of, Saudi Arabia, UAE, a lot of their energy exports flow through Qatar. That would have, I think, major global implications. So we're in this period where I think there's a chance of that military escalation. But also, as with everything else, Trump and the Trump administration is looking to make a deal, right? They're trying to, end conflicts like the ones in Ukraine, as well as what we've seen in, in Gaza, Lebanon, et cetera, in order to strike a deal that's favorable to the U.S. But that's going to be, I think, a difficult, that's going to be a tall order. We're seeing some of the pushback against some elements of Gaza currently, the ceasefire agreement there. So I do think this is probably, I mean, aside from China, a key area to watch in the U.S. relationship, and one that could either, enhance the broader strategic plan, or it could significantly complicate it, as events in the Middle East tend to do for U.S. administrations.
Okay, I understand. And I guess it's wraps up very well our discussion. Thank you very much, Eugene. It was a pleasure talking to you, and thank you for sharing your insights and analysis.
Yeah, it was my pleasure. Thank you, Denys.